course, we knew that there are plans by the fiscal authorities to borrow more this year. But they say that at least on the external arm, they'll be getting those loans at concessionary rates. According to the policymakers, also the cost of servicing domestic debt has become too much of a burden, and they're looking out more to foreign debt. Well, that's what will be part of what we'll be looking at today. Well, thank you so much, Henry, for being here.
Thank you very much.
You did an article recently in one of the national dailies, and you expressed worry, as some other analysts have. But it's still an ongoing conversation. The more analysts talk about it, the more the federal government holds on to its position that, look, we must borrow. And if we look at it from the point of the debt to GDP ratio, where right now we're at 18%, that's our debt to GDP ratio. If we compare it to the maximum limit globally accepted, which is 40%, they say we're doing okay. As a matter of fact, the term on the borrowed keeps coming up. We are currently on the borrowed, so we should borrow more, so long as we do not let it get out of hand and we have it below, that debt to GDP ratio.
Thank you, Esther. I think we should remind ourselves, because they say history repeats itself, and we should be reminded that some years ago, we were also told that we were under-borrowed, that Nigeria was under-borrowed. And we gradually, as a result, committed ourselves recklessly and carelessly to debt accumulation. The result of that was that we eventually got into a debt trap. And I must say, Nigeria was not the only one to fall into that debt trap. Quite a number of other African countries similarly had the same problem. And the Jubilee debt campaign under one Trisha Rogers, led the advocacy that all debts owed by developing countries, particularly in Africa, should be cancelled. And quite a number of countries had 100% debt write-off. I think we had 60% or thereabouts. We did not get 100%. The point I'm making is that we have been in the position in the past where we had been assured that we were under-borrowed, therefore we should borrow more. Eventually, we got our fingers burnt. Some years down the road, today, we are back at the same juncture. And we are being told 18% of GDP as a debt burden is nothing, go for 40. And not only that, we are told that we have been doing so well that the IMF World Bank consortium, who presumably are positioned to advance loans to us, say that we have done so well, so we would go into a higher interest rate bracket. In other words, we would have to pay more for our loans, but they encourage us to increase the portfolio so that we could be nearer 40%, because, as I say, we must consider the historical perspective and say, could this be deja vu?
Now, it was saying that the federal government have identified what they call the problem areas, and they identified the domestic debt. 6 trillion naira is where we are right now. They say the cost of servicing is quite high. Now, for the 2013 budget, 592 billion has been earmarked for debt servicing of the local debt that the government has taken, even though there's going to be a 100 billion naira sinking fund to retire those bonds. But they said they can no longer take loans, or at least debt on the local scene, and of course they want to leave some room for a corporate or the private sector to be able to access credits, which is a good thing. So wouldn't it? I mean, look at what other options do they have? They have to.
I think you have been a little bit optimistic.
Stating the facts as they are. I mean, if you're taking your domestic stock, 6 trillion, and the cost of servicing it, because the earmarks for this year is actually higher than what was earmarked for 2012 budget. So who knows? It might even climb. So obviously perhaps they're trying to nip it in the bud, and let's just stop right where we are, try to offset it, and then look for the options.
Maybe we should look at what really is the cause of our borrowing, and maybe we should then look at what is responsible for the high cost of our borrowing, and then we should now look at also how sustainable in terms of repayment those debts can be. I mean, any other thing outside that is really a distraction. Okay, so in terms of the costs, why are we accumulating debt so rapidly? Now, you would say in order that we should be able to expand our infrastructural base, yeah? But that is the same story we've had for over 30 years. Meanwhile, our transportation system is decrepit, our health services are decrepit, our educational system is decrepit, our cost of living continues to spiral. We are, like a simpleton, paying over 2 trillion naira, a third of total projected expenditure as subsidy. So you have to give me some kind of additional confidence-boosting reason why I should believe that this time you will get it right, because nothing has changed. We have been accumulating debt steadily over the years, and like you say, it should have gone into infrastructure, but we cannot feel it. So presumably, these so-called borrowings have not ended up in areas that would give any succor to our people. So, having said so, you should wonder, do we really have a cause to borrow? Because at the moment, we have a situation where the total revenue streams have not been appropriately compounded. For example, the Federal Inland Revenue Service in 2012 indicated that they collected revenue to the tune of about 5 trillion naira. The Customs Board, Customs Service, collected close to 1 trillion naira. That's 6 trillion naira. We haven't even talked about crude oil earnings. But I tell you what, the total expenditure in the 2012 budget was nowhere near 6 trillion naira. So, what I'm saying in other words is that it appears we have a surplus. Why did we borrow in 2012? And we seem to be repeating the same thing. If anything, we can expect the revenue projections of the FRS to possibly exceed 5 trillion and go to 6 trillion. We can expect the customs to go above 1 trillion. And guess what? What is the total projected expenditure? Still less than 6 trillion naira. And yet we have not spoken about other income streams, particularly the one that provides 80% of our current revenue earnings, which is crude oil. Okay? So I want to be educated, and I expect that most Nigerians also would want to know, why are we borrowing? What is the cause of this borrowing? And I'll tell you, it seems rather strange if you say that you are borrowing in order to be able to meet infrastructural needs or even to cover a budget deficit.
That's why we have the DMO. That's why governments all over the world borrow in the
Absolutely. You know, but it is very worrying to say you are borrowing for these purposes, these genuine purposes. Don't forget, first, we haven't seen the results of this borrowing in the past. But secondly, we now say you are borrowing because you have an income shortfall. But as I have told you just now, as I've explained, that is a bit ambiguous. We're not really sure whether we have an income shortfall, because at the same time that you're complaining about a shortfall, you are dividing what you consider to be a surplus. You cannot have a revenue shortfall and a deficit and at the same time have surplus to spend. If I give you a small example, if you had a total budget of 100 naira to meet your needs, okay, but unfortunately your income streams can only provide 50. Okay, that means you have a shortfall of 50 naira. You have a deficit of 50 naira. You can be expected to go borrow that 50 naira if what you want to use the money for is critical and useful, will be eventually useful. Okay, but if in the process a great-great-grand uncle whom you hadn't met before died and gave you 50 naira, would you still need to go borrow the 50 naira in order to close your deficit? You probably wouldn't, as a sensible person. Okay, but here in our case, we have a situation where you already have an excess crude account, which has been consistently there for the past 10, 11, 12 years, okay, which the legislature, the executive, and the 3 tiers of government, they divide amongst themselves, while simultaneously maintaining a deficit and borrowing in order to cover the deficit. It would seem
that it's obviously, I mean, it's not enough. That's why they keep fighting that's why.
No, you don't understand. It cannot be not enough when you have a surplus.
But that's what they
okay?
say. That's what
No. I mean, you know, if somebody tells you something that's absolutely silly, you don't have to, you know, you have to be able to question it and say, look, does it make sense that you have a surplus that you are spending and dividing freely? Meanwhile, you say you have a deficit that you are borrowing, and not only borrowing at 1, 2, 3%, that is normally consonant with sovereign risk-free, sovereign debts, which are